Her name was Cora Ellison. She was 51 years old. And the morning the bank nailed the foreclosure notice to her own screen door, she was standing at the churn with the butter half turned. She heard the hammer. 3 flat blows on her own porch. She did not stop. She finished the churn first. She worked the dasher up and down until the butter came. Until it gathered and squeaked against the wood, because a churn left half done is butter wasted, and Cora Ellison had never wasted a thing in her life. Only then did she wipe her hands on her apron and walk out and read her own name off the paper. 2 weeks later, she stood at the counter of the Cutler County Farmers and Merchants Bank. 11 neighbors stood behind her, waiting to make their deposits. And the bank president, Harlan Meacham, slid her ledger back across the marble and said it loud enough for every one of them to hear. "A woman's egg money doesn't pay a man's debt. Mrs. Ellison, sell before the sheriff does it for you." That night, she took down a blue lard tin from the pantry shelf, the one nobody in town knew she kept, and by lamplight, she began to count 6 years of stamped receipts. If you have ever had your work called nothing by a man who never counted it, this story is for you. Before we go on, do one thing for me: subscribe so this old Nebraska story finds the people who need it. And leave a comment telling me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Cora Ellison travels. Now let me take you back to the start. It was 1934, the 3rd year of the drought, the 3rd year of the dust. You have to understand what that meant on the high plains of Nebraska. The rain had quit in 31 and it had not come back honest since. The topsoil had turned to powder. When the wind came out of the west, and it came most days, it lifted that powder into the sky and carried it east in a brown wall you could watch coming for an hour. It got into the milk. It got into the flour. It sifted through the window frames no matter how you stuffed them. Folks hung wet sheets over the beds at night and woke with the shape of their own bodies printed clean on the mattress, and the dust caked everywhere else. And the wells were dying. That was the quiet horror of it. One farm at a time, the water went. It turned brackish first, tasted of iron and salt, and then it went to mud, and then it went to nothing. A man would let a bucket down and hear it strike dry sand. All up and down Cutler County, the windmills were pumping air. All except one. The Ellison well ran deep, and it ran sweet. It ran clean and cold through the worst of it, because Cora's husband, Thomas, had gone deeper than any sane man in the township back in 1920. He had mortgaged the whole quarter section for it. $2,400, borrowed against 160 acres, to drill down past the shallow water everyone else was content with, down to the aquifer that did not care what the sky did. The neighbors had called him a fool for it in 1920. In 1934, they came to that well with their milk cans and their wagons, and Cora Ellison never once turned a soul away thirsty. Thomas had been dead 3 years by then. He was a soldier before he was a farmer. He had gone to France in 1918, a boy, and he had breathed the gas in the argon, and it had lived in his chest ever afterward like a debt that only ever charged interest. It took him slow. It took him a piece at a time, one winter's cough worse than the last, until the winter of 1931 took the rest. He died in the front room with his hand in hers and the note on the quarter section not yet paid. So Cora took it up. All of it. Understand what she was carrying. 160 acres. A dairy herd that had to be milked twice a day, dark of the morning and dark of the evening, no Sundays, no holidays, no sick days, because a cow does not care that you are tired. A flock of white leghorn hens, near 200 of them, that had to be fed and watered and gathered and kept from the foxes and the hawks. And the churning, and the separating, and the packing. 12 dozen eggs a week, 40 pounds of butter. She hauled them into the town of Holloway every Saturday in the same wagon Thomas had bought, behind the same mare. And she sold them at a Steps grocery and to half the houses on the good end of Main Street. Because everyone knew Ellison butter was the sweetest in the county, and her eggs were always fresh and always clean. She was good at it. That is the part I want you to hold on to. She was not a poor widow clinging on. She was a farmer, and a fine one, and she ran that place better alone than most men ran theirs with 3 sons. Her books were straight, her fences held, her cows came in fat off ground that starved other men's stock. When you saw Cora Ellison at market, back straight, apron white, counting change into your palm without ever once counting it wrong, you were looking at competence. Plain, unglamorous, iron competence. And here is the thing she did. The thing that mattered more than anyone in Holloway understood at the time. Every Saturday, after the household was fed, after the feed was bought and the kerosene and the few dry goods, she could not raise herself. She took what was left of that egg and butter money, every cash dollar of it, and she walked it to the bank. And she paid it down on Thomas's note. Not the interest only, the principal. Dollar by dollar. $9 one week. 6 the next. 11 if the eggs ran good. Whatever the hens and the churn had earned, above the living, went against the debt her husband had died still owing. She had been doing it for 6 years. 6 years, near enough every week. Through his dying and long past it. It was the one promise she had made him at the end that she meant to keep with her own 2 hands. She would hand that land to no one but herself, free and clear, and she would do it on butter money, 1 coin at a time. And every time she made a payment, the old teller stamped her a receipt. Walt Dorsey, his name was. 60-some years old, been at that bank since before it changed hands. He would take her cash and count it and press the bank's stamp on a little slip and initial it in his own hand, WD, and slide it across to her. And Cora would fold it and carry it home and drop it in a blue lard tin she kept on the pantry shelf behind the flour. She never told a soul why she kept them. If you'd asked her back then, she'd have shrugged and said she just liked to keep the little slips. That was all. She kept the little slips. She did not yet know what they were worth. Nobody did. The trouble started with the new man. Harlan Meacham came to the Cutler County Farmers and Merchants Bank in 1932. The old president had died, and the ownership had shuffled somewhere back east, and they had sent Meacham out to run it. He was 45, soft-handed, careful of his collars. He wore a watch chain across a vest that had never once been sweated through. He smiled a great deal, and it never reached above his mouth. And Meacham had a friend. A man named Vernon Ashby of the Cutler Land and Cattle Company. Ashby was a buyer of distressed ground. In a county full of drying farms and men who could not make their notes, a man like Ashby did very well. He drove out from the county seat in a clean black automobile, and he looked at other people's ruin the way a butcher looks at a hog. What Ashby wanted, that summer of '34, was water. His company had bought up 2 full sections north of Holloway for pennies, good grazing ground gone worthless the day the wells failed. Land with no water is land that grows nothing and holds nothing. But land with water, deep water, drought-proof water, in a county where every other well had gone to dust? That land was worth a fortune. That land you could stock, and sell, and lease, and never worry. There was exactly one such well in the township. You already know whose it was. Now, I want you to see how it happened, because it did not happen all at once. Cruelty rarely does. It comes in steps, and each step is small enough that you tell yourself it must be a mistake, right up until the step that isn't. The first step came on an ordinary Saturday. Cora came to the counter with her week's payment, $9, in coin and a worn bill or 2. But Walt Dorsey was not at his window. There was a young man there she did not know, and standing just behind him, watching, was Meacham himself. She laid down her $9 and said she'd like it put to the note, the same as always. Meacham picked up her ledger card. He looked at it a long moment. And then he said the payment was irregular. He said it in that soft, pleasant voice. Irregular, he said the note was, in fact, in arrears. He said there seemed to be some confusion in her account, and he could not credit a loose cash payment against a debt that was already behind. Cora stood very still. In arrears. That could not be. She knew to the dollar what she had paid and what was left. She was not behind. She was ahead. She was years ahead of where Thomas had died. She said as much, quietly. She said there must be some error in his book, that she had her payments recorded, that Walt Dorsey could tell him. Meacham smiled and said Walt Dorsey was no longer with the bank. That stopped her. She had not heard. She asked when. This spring, Meacham said. And he did not say why. He took her $9 anyway. He had the young man write her a receipt for it and stamp it. But he would not say what it went against, and when she asked to see the ledger for herself, he closed it and said the bank's records were the bank's business, and that she'd do better to come back when she could speak to it sensibly. Cora took her receipt. She did not argue further, not there, not with the young man watching and a line forming behind her. She was not a woman who made a scene. She folded the slip, and she drove home. And at home, she did what she always did. She went to the pantry, and she took down the blue lard tin, and she dropped the day's stamp slip in on top of the others. Like always. 6 years of them under her hand, and she barely looked. She did not yet understand what she was holding. But something had turned cold in her chest, and it did not warm up again for a long while. The second step came 11 days later, in an envelope. It was a printed notice. 30 days, it said. 30 days notice of the bank's intent to foreclose upon the property and improvements known as the Ellison quarter section, in default of the note dated 1920, the balance now due and owing being, and here was the number that made no sense in the world. $1,180. Cora read it standing in her own kitchen. She read it 3 times. $1,180. On a note of $2,400 that she had been paying down out of her own hand for 6 years. It was not possible. It was not within a country mile of possible. She had paid it down to nearly nothing. She knew she had. And here was the bank's own paper telling her she owed better than half the original sum. As though she had never made a payment at all. As though 6 years of butter money had simply evaporated, gone up like water off a hot stone. She drove to town. Meacham saw her in his office this time, which was worse than the counter. Because in his office there were no 11 neighbors, only his desk and his soft hands, and a hired man of his named Ott, standing by the door with his hat in his hands, saying nothing, being a witness to nothing that would ever help her. She laid the notice on his desk. She said the number was wrong. She said it plainly, without heat, because heat was not her way. She said she had paid faithfully every week for 6 years and the balance could not be what the paper said, and she would like the account gone through, entry by entry, in front of her. Meacham folded his soft hands. He said he understood her distress. He said these things were hard for a woman alone to keep track of. He said perhaps she had confused what she'd paid with what she'd meant to pay. And then he leaned back, and he told her what he'd truly called her in for. He said the kindest thing she could do for herself was to sell. He said there was a serious buyer. A man of means, ready to pay a fair figure, cash, and settle the note and leave her something besides, to make a fresh start somewhere sensible. In town, maybe, where a widow didn't have to break her back. He said this with great gentleness, as though he were doing her a mercy. Sell to a serious buyer while you still can, he said, before the sheriff does it, and you walk away with nothing at all. And it was as she stood to go, sick to her stomach and holding her back straight by main force, that she saw the man coming out of the side room. A clean-suited man with a soft belly and hard little eyes, settling his hat, having plainly heard every word through the wall. He nodded to her, polite as a snake, and went past her out to a clean black automobile parked in the sun. She did not know his name yet. But she knew what he was. She had seen his kind circling the dying farms all that year. Vernon Ashby got into his automobile and drove away, and Cora Ellison stood in the dust of the street and understood for the first time that this was not a mistake in a book. This was a thing being done to her. On purpose. For the water. The third step was the public one. And it was the one that broke something open. It came on Grange Day. The one day a month the farm families all came into Holloway together, wagons and few automobiles lining Main Street, the women trading eggs and gossip and quilting patterns, the men standing in knots outside the feed store talking rain that would not come. The whole township, or near it, in one place. And that was the day the sheriff's sale bill went up on the courthouse door. Cora did not know it was there until she felt the change in the street. You know how a crowd goes quiet in a certain way, how the talk drops and folks start looking at you sideways and then looking away. She felt it before she understood it. She was at her wagon with a crate of eggs, and she felt the whole street turn strange around her, and she looked up. And there was a knot of people over by the courthouse steps reading something nailed to the door, and one of them was reading it out loud. The Ellison quarter section. 160 acres, all improvements, the dwelling, the barn, the stock, and, it said it right in the bill, the well. To be sold at public auction on the courthouse steps in 30 days. To satisfy the debt owed the Cutler County Farmers and Merchants Bank. Her name, her land, her husband's grave was on that land. Read out loud on Main Street for the whole county to hear. And Meacham was there. That was the thing. He had come out onto the steps, drawn by the crowd, and when he saw her standing frozen by her wagon, he did not have the grace to look away. He came halfway down the steps. There were 11 people close enough to hear him plain, and more behind, and he must have known it, and he said it anyway. He said it the way a man says a thing he wants remembered. Now, Mrs. Ellison, don't make it harder than it is. Egg money doesn't pay a man's debt. It never has and it never will. The dust hung in the street. Nobody spoke. Somewhere down the block a windmill creaked, pumping nothing. Cora Ellison looked at him. She looked at the bill with her name on it. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, some ashamed, some pitying. A few, she saw it. A few already deciding she'd been foolish. A woman trying to do a man's job and failing at it, just as this smooth fellow said. And she did not cry. I want you to hear that. She stood in the middle of that street with her whole life nailed to a door, and 30 days on the clock, and the man who did it grinning at her from the steps, and she did not give him one single tear. She said, "We'll see." Just that. 2 words. Quiet and even. And she turned back to her wagon, and she settled her crate of eggs. And she drove home through the dust with her back as straight as a fence post. But something had been decided in her on that street. Something had gone from hurt to cold. Because she remembered the slips. That night she did not sleep. She lit the lamp, and she went to the pantry, and she took down the blue lard tin, and for the first time in 6 years she did not just drop a slip in. She poured the whole of them out on the kitchen table. 6 years of paper. Hundreds of little slips. Every one of them stamped with the bank's own stamp. Every one of them initialed in Walt Dorsey's steady hand. W.D. 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 A small blue witness, over and over, to money she had truly paid. And she began to count. She was good with figures. She had to be, to run what she ran. She sorted the slips by year, and she added them, week by week, careful as she'd ever been at anything. It took her most of the night. The lamp burned low, and she trimmed it and kept on. $9, $6, $11, $7.50. Every honest week of butter and eggs laid out in blue ink, and when she had them all totaled, and set that total against the $2,400 and the years of interest, she sat very still and looked at the number she had made. By her own hand, on the bank's own receipts, she had paid the note down to about $290. $290. The bank said she owed $1,180. She sat in the low lamplight, and she looked at that gap. Nearly $900. $900 of her butter money, paid in, stamped for, and vanished off the bank's books as though it had never crossed the counter. And here is where the widow they had all underestimated showed you what 6 years married to a careful man had taught her. Because Cora Ellison understood something in that moment that Harlan Meacham had bet his whole scheme on her not understanding. A receipt is not a request. A receipt is the bank's own admission. When Walt Dorsey stamped that slip and pressed those initials, the bank was saying, in its own hand, we took this money from this woman on this day. That slip did not argue with the bank's ledger. That slip stood over the bank's ledger. It was the depositor's proof, and it was worth more than any entry Meacham could scratch out or leave off, because a man can change a book in a back room, but he cannot change a paper that is sitting in a widow's pantry a mile out of town. Thomas had taught her that, though he never knew he was teaching it. Keep every slip, he used to say. A bank's memory is only as good as your paper. She had thought it was just a careful man's habit. It was the thing that was going to save the farm. She had the proof. 6 years of it. What she did not yet have was the how. How had the money gone in and come out on the other side as nothing? Where had it gone? A thing like that did not happen by accident. And it did not happen by one man alone at a counter. Somewhere there was a book with the trick written in it. And somewhere there was a man who knew. There was, in fact. And Meacham had fired him that spring. Cora found Walt Dorsey in a little rented house at the poor end of Holloway, where he'd been living quiet since the bank let him go. He was thinner than she remembered, and there was a shame on him that had nothing to do with anything he'd done, the shame a working man carries when work is taken from him for no reason he's allowed to know. She showed him the tin. She poured the slips on his table the way she'd poured them on her own, and she watched his old face as he looked at all those initials in his own hand. Years of them. And she told him what she'd counted and what the bank claimed and the size of the hole between. Walt Dorsey looked at the slips a long time. And then he got up, without a word, and went to a trunk in the corner, and he took out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Carbons, years of them. Because it turned out old Walt had a careful habit of his own. Every time he'd pressed a stamp and initialed a slip, he'd kept the carbon copy underneath. Every cash payment he'd ever taken across that counter, from her and from a good many others, he had a shadow of it in his own hand, filed away by date. He said he'd started doing it years back, after a dispute over a deposit, and just never stopped. He said a teller who keeps his own tally sleeps better. He said Meacham had fired him in the spring. And he said now, quietly, that he'd wondered ever since exactly why. He was too good at his job to steal, and too old to threaten. But a man who keeps honest records of every dollar that comes in, that man is a problem, if what you mean to do is make dollars disappear. They sat at his kitchen table, the old teller and the widow. And they laid her slips beside his carbons and matched them one by one. And there it was, every payment agreed. Her paper and his paper told the same true story, down to the dollar, week after week, year after year. She had paid what she said she'd paid. There was no confusion, no woman's muddle, no honest error. Which meant the bank's $1,180 was not a mistake either. It was a lie with arithmetic behind it. And now she had 2 witnesses to the truth of it, her tin and his trunk, that agreed with each other and damned the ledger both. But they still didn't have the mechanism. Not yet. And Walt Dorsey, who had spent 40 years inside banks, sat back and thought about it, and then he told her how a thing like this is generally done. He said the money never has to leave the building. That's the beauty of it, if you can call it that. When a payment comes in and a crooked man doesn't want it to help you, he doesn't pocket it. Pocketing shows up in account. What he does is he posts it to a holding line. A suspense account, the banks call it. A drawer for money that hasn't been decided yet. Money in between. Your cash goes into the bank, real as anything, and Walt stamps you a real receipt for it. But on the ledger, upstairs, it never gets carried across to your loan. It sits in suspense. It doesn't touch your principal. And your note just goes right on growing interest as though you'd never paid a cent. Do that quiet, week after week, for a year or two, Walt said. And a widow who's actually paid her farm nearly clear will show on the books as deep in arrears, deep enough to foreclose, deep enough to sell cheap and fast to a friend who's been waiting for the well. Cora sat with that. Then she asked the question that mattered. She asked if that was legal. Walt Dorsey looked at her. And for the first time that night, something like a hard light came into his tired old eyes. He said no. He said it was not a dispute, and it was not sharp practice, and it was not a gray thing lawyers could argue both ways. He said taking a depositor's money in and hiding it in a suspense line to fake a default, that was theft. That was embezzlement, plain, of the kind the state did not let a bank settle privately with an apology. He said a thing like that, once it was written down and sworn to and put in front of the right man, was not a matter the bank got to decide. Because there was a man whose whole job was exactly this: a state bank examiner. And an examiner, Walt said, is not like a sheriff you can lean on, or a neighbor you can shame, or a widow you can bully off her land. An examiner works for the state of Nebraska. And when a sworn, written complaint of misapplied depositor funds lands on his desk, he is compelled to act. He does not get to look away for a friend. He comes, and he opens the books, all of them, the suspense line and every other, and if the money is where the complaint says it is, then the whole thing falls on the man who hid it. They sat in that little kitchen a long while after that, the lamp low, the dust ticking against the window glass. Cora Ellison had come in a wronged widow with a tin of paper. She was going out something else. She had the proof, she had the witness, she had the mechanism, and she had the name of the one man in the world Harlan Meacham could not smile at, could not lean on, could not buy. She could have gone to the bank the next morning and thrown it all in Meacham's soft face. Part of her wanted to. Part of her wanted him to know she knew. Wanted to watch that mouth-only smile fall off him right there at his own counter. But she didn't. She sat with her cold coffee, and she thought about the 30 days on the clock and the black automobile and the well they all wanted. And she understood that a warning would only tell Meacham to start covering his tracks. A wronged woman shouting is a thing a clever man can manage. A wronged woman who says nothing at all and quietly, patiently sets a trap made of the man's own paper, that is a different thing entirely. She looked at Walt Dorsey. She said she was not going to say one word to Meacham. She was going to let him keep on believing exactly what he already believed. That a farm widow keeps no records. That she reads no fine print. That her butter money isn't real. She was going to let him believe he'd already won. And while he smiled and while Ashby walked her well, she was going to sit down at her own kitchen table, with her tin and Walt's carbons beside her, and she was going to write it all out. Every date, every dollar, every slip. She was going to swear to it, and she was going to put it in an envelope addressed to the state bank examiner in Lincoln, and ask for an audit, and she was going to do it before the smile ever left Harlan Meacham's face. The lamp guttered. Outside, the wind was coming up again out of the west, carrying the dry ground somewhere else the way it always did now. Cora Ellison reached out and squared the stack of 6 years of slips against the tabletop, tapping them even. The way she'd square a hand of anything she meant to play. She had 30 days. And she hadn't even picked up the pen yet. She picked up the pen. It was Thomas's pen. The fat black one he'd carried home from the Argonne in a tin cup of 1,000 small things, and it still wrote if you warmed the nib against your thumb first. She warmed it. She smoothed a sheet of writing paper flat on the oilcloth. And then, for a long minute, she didn't write anything at all. She was thinking about how you tell the truth so a stranger 400 miles away will believe it. Not loud. Loud was what Meacham wanted. She could feel that now. Plain as weather. A shouting widow was a story a clever man could bend. She would give him no story to bend. She'd give a man in Lincoln nothing but numbers and dates and the name of the teller who'd stamped every one. So that's what she wrote. She wrote the year the note was taken, 1920, and the sum of it, $2,400, for the well that reached the good water when every other well in the township had been giving up brackish mud. She wrote that her husband died of the gas in his lungs in 1931, and she had carried the note on alone. She wrote what she paid, and when, and how cash, at the counter, out of egg and butter money, near every week for 6 years. She wrote that a teller named Walt Dorsey had stamped and initialed each receipt. She wrote that she had kept every one. And she wrote the two numbers side by side so a stranger couldn't miss them. The bank says I owe $1,180. By my own stamped receipts I owe near $290. Then she wrote the word she'd been circling all night without letting it land. She wrote that she believed her payments had been carried on the books to some account that was not the note, on purpose, so the farm could be called into default and sold cheap to a man who wanted the well. And she asked. She didn't demand, she asked, the way you ask a doctor to look, for a state examiner to come and open the books. She signed it Cora Ellison. Under that she wrote widow, because it was true and because a man in Lincoln should have to hold that word in his hand. At the bottom she left room, and the next morning she took the sheet to the young county attorney, a fellow named Pratt with ink on his cuff and not 30 years on him, and she had him witness her swear to it. He read it twice. He was quiet a while. Then he told her a sworn complaint of misapplied funds wasn't a quarrel between a customer and a bank. It was a thing the state had to answer. He said it the way you'd tell someone the frost had already come. Not to scare her, just so she'd know the ground had changed. She mailed it from the Holloway post office with her own 3-cent stamp and watched the clerk drop it in the sack. That was all. No thunder. A letter going into a canvas bag with 100 other letters. But something had turned over in her. Quiet and final, like a plow lifting the first cut of sod. She had done the thing that could not be undone. Whatever came now, she had already thrown her stone. She had 22 days. Now came the hard part, and it wasn't the paper. It was the smiling. Because a trap made of a man's own arrogance only springs if the man keeps believing he's winning. So Cora Ellison went to town, and she let Harlan Meacham win. She went in on a Tuesday, dressed plain, her chin not so high. She stood at the counter where he'd shamed her, and she let her voice go tired. She told him she'd been thinking on what he said. She told him maybe he was right, maybe a woman couldn't hold a place like that alone, not through a drought, not at her age. She said she supposed she'd see about a buyer. She watched his face while she said it. She watched the ease come into it, the softness of a man hearing exactly what he'd expected to hear all along. He came around the counter. He put a hand near her elbow, not on it, and he told her she was being sensible. He said there was no shame in it. He said a serious man might even pay her a fair price for her trouble, and wouldn't that be better than the sheriff? Cora looked at the floor and said she supposed it would. She'd never in her life had to work so hard to keep her hands still. 2 days after, the black automobile came up her section road, slow, and Vernon Ashby got out of it in his town shoes and walked her yard like he already owned the dirt. She let him. She stood on the porch with a dish towel in her hands, and she let him walk to the well house and lift the cover and look down into the one deep cold shaft of good water left in that whole dry township. He dropped a pebble. He listened to it hit. She saw the greed go across his face, plain as a man reading a winning hand, and she thought, "Look all you want, Mr. Ashby. Look your fill." He tipped his hat when he left. He called her ma'am. She smiled at him with her mouth and hated him with the rest of her, and waved from the porch until his dust was gone off down the road. That was the first cycle. She'd played beaten, and they'd believed her, and it had cost her more than any of them would ever know. The second cycle came near a week later, and it near stopped her heart. Walt Dorsey drove out to her place after dark with his lights off the last quarter mile. He came in the kitchen door pale as a Sunday shirt. Meacham knew something was coming, he said. A letter had come to the bank, not to Meacham, to the bank, official, on Lincoln paper, saying an examiner named Estep would be looking at the books. Meacham had read it standing up, Walt said, and gone the color of ash, and then he'd started asking questions. Quiet ones. Who'd been in the vault? Who kept old slips? Whether anybody around town made a habit of holding on to receipts. He'd come to Walt himself, Walt said, right to his rented house, stood in the door and asked, friendly as a snake, whether Walt happened to have kept any of his old teller carbons, seeing as they were bank property and ought to be returned. Cora's mouth went dry. She asked what he'd said. Walt said he'd told Meacham he burned all that trash the day he was fired. He said he'd made himself grin while he lied. And then, soon as Meacham's car was gone, he'd gone home and moved his oilcloth bundle out of his trunk and put it he wouldn't say where, someplace not his house. Cora had already done the same with the tin. It wasn't on the pantry shelf anymore. It hadn't been for a week. She'd taken it out one night with a lantern and buried it, wrapped in a flour sack in a mason crock, out under the loose board of the well house floor, under the very water they were all so hungry for. She didn't tell Walt where. She didn't tell anybody. If Meacham tore her whole house apart, he'd find an empty shelf and a ring in the dust where a lard tin used to sit. Let him wonder, she thought. Let him lie awake wondering. They sat in her dark kitchen a long time that night. The two of them, an old fired teller and a widow, saying little. He was scared. She could see it. He was 60-some years old, and he'd given his working life to that bank, and the man who ran it now would ruin him without a blink if it saved his own neck. She reached across and put her hand flat on the table near his, not quite touching. The way you'd gentle a horse. She told him he didn't have to do anything but keep his bundle safe and tell the truth once, to one honest man, when the day came. She told him she'd carry the rest. He looked at her a while. Then he nodded, slow, and some of the color came back into him. Relief then, but thin relief. The kind you know won't last. The third cycle didn't come to her. She had to go find it. And when she found it, it changed the whole shape of the thing. It started with Ruth Pardee at the Grange, of all places, pulling Cora aside by the coat sleeve behind the coffee urns. Ruth had heard, the way farm wives hear everything, through 100 kitchen doors, that Cora had been keeping her bank slips. And Ruth wanted to know, low and careful, whether Cora thought a body ought to be able to trust the number the bank wrote in its own book. Cora went still. She asked Ruth why she asked. And Ruth told her. Ruth had a little note of her own at the Cutler County Bank, an old one on a cream separator, and she'd been paying it down out of her own butter money $3-4 at a time. And last month she'd gone in to ask her balance, and the number they read her back was higher than she thought it ought to be. And when she'd said so, the new fellow at the counter had smiled at her the same soft way and told her she must be misremembering. Egg money's hard to keep track of, he'd said. Women's arithmetic, he might as well have said. Cora asked, quiet as she could hold it, did Ruth keep her slips? Ruth said she had a drawer full. Didn't everybody? By the end of that Grange day there were 4 of them. 4 farm wives standing in the cold cloakroom with their coats still on, each one with the same story and the same soft drawer of stamped paper at home. By the end of the week there were 7. 7 women who'd each been shorted a few dollars here and a few there, small enough that no one woman would fight it, small enough to look like her own bad memory, but laid side by side. 7 ledgers of butter and egg money that didn't match the bank's books, and every mismatch running the same direction, toward Meacham's pocket. It wasn't just her farm anymore. It hadn't ever been. It was a machine, and she was only the biggest gear it had tried to strip. Cora took every one of those women to young Pratt, and Pratt wrote it all down, and Pratt wrote another letter to Lincoln. Not a complaint this time, but a folder, a stack, a pattern, and when word came back, it came in Pratt's own steady hand across her kitchen table. The examiner, Mr. Estep, was coming himself. Not sending paper. Coming. And he meant to be standing at the courthouse the morning of the sale. Cora read that line twice, and then she set it down, and she looked out her window at the dry section rolling away west, and she let herself, for one breath, feel something close to hope. She had 12 days. She should have known a cornered man doesn't wait for the day you've set him. The blow came on a Thursday, and it came the way the worst things always come, through a neighbor boy on a bicycle. Breathless, with a bill in his hand, he'd torn off the courthouse door because he thought she'd want to see it. The sale had been moved up, not 30 days, not the date she'd counted to and built her whole slow trap around. Meacham had gone to the sheriff. Cora would learn later he'd leaned on a note the sheriff's brother-in-law owed the bank. And he'd had the sheriff's sale moved forward a full week. Ashby's cash was ready. The auction would open Monday morning on the courthouse steps. Monday, 3 days. And here was the cold arithmetic of it. The thing that sat on Cora's chest that night like a stone off the well cap. The examiner wasn't due till the old date. A step might not make it. And in the room, on the day, the only paper the sheriff was bound to honor was the bank's ledger. That fat book with its false $1,180 written in Meacham's own hand, and nothing standing against it but a widow's word and a lard tin no court had ever heard of. Meacham had figured it exactly right. Beat the audit. Sell the farm before Lincoln could open a single book. Once the deed changed hands on the courthouse steps and Ashby's check cleared, an examiner could prove all the fraud he liked. The well would already be sold. The widow already off her land, and untangling it would take lawyers and years Cora Ellison didn't have. She sat up most of that night. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying quiet years ago, over a man with ruined lungs, and she had none left to spend on Harlan Meacham. She thought instead. She sent Pratt to the telegraph office at dawn with a wire to Lincoln that had 4 words that mattered in it: sale moved up Monday. And then there was nothing left to do but dig the tin back out of the wellhouse floor. And count it one more time by lamplight so her hands would know the weight of it, and wait for Monday to come. It came dry and white and windless. Holloway hadn't seen a crowd like it since the war ended. Word of a sheriff's sale travels a drought county fast, half of them there because they feared their own place might be next on that door. Half because a man being sold out is the closest thing to theater a broke town gets. They stood 3 deep in the dust of the courthouse yard. The Grange wives were down in front, Ruth Pardee among them, coats buttoned though it wasn't cold, and every one of them had a hand pressed flat against a coat pocket that crackled when she moved. Harlan Meacham stood on the top step in a good gray suit, smiling that mouth-only smile, greeting men by name. Vernon Ashby stood a little apart with his checkbook already out of his coat, tapping it against his leg, watching the wellward road like a man impatient to go count his water. Ott was there, silent, hands folded. And the sheriff, red-faced and not liking it, came out with the sale bill in his hand and a little brass bell he rang twice for quiet. Cora Ellison came up through the crowd with the blue lard tin held in both arms against her chest like a churn. She wore her Sunday dress. Walt Dorsey walked at her right shoulder with an oilcloth bundle under his arm. And behind them, unhurried, in a Darktown coat and spectacles, came a stranger nobody in Holloway had ever laid eyes on, carrying a flat leather case. The sheriff cleared his throat and read the top of the bill. The Ellison Quarter, 160 acres, improvements and water rights. To be sold at public auction to satisfy a debt held by Cutler County Farmers and Merchants Bank. He asked, by law, was there any objection before the bidding? "There is," Cora said. She didn't shout it. She said it the way you'd answer in church, but the yard went quiet as a stopped clock, because the widow they'd all watched get shamed at the counter was standing on the bottom step with her chin level, and she was speaking. "Sheriff," she said, "I'd ask you by law to enter the depositor's own record before this farm is sold on the banks." Meacham's smile flickered, just once, just at the corner. "This is no place for a scene, Mrs. Ellison. The books are the books." "They are," Cora said. "Let's have them all then," and she set the blue lard tin down on the wide stone step in front of the whole town, and she took off the lid. 6 years came out of that tin. Slip after slip, thin and soft, cornered from handling, each one stamped with the bank's own die and initialed in the same faded hand. She laid them out along the step in rows, and the front of the crowd leaned to see, and you could hear the paper whisper. "Every dollar of egg and butter money I ever carried to that counter," she said, loud enough now to reach the back. "Stamped by the bank. Signed by the bank's own teller. The bank's admission, in the bank's own ink." Walt Dorsey stepped up beside her. He unrolled his oilcloth on the stone and laid his carbons down in a second row, and they matched, date for date, dollar for dollar, the ghost copy of every stamp he'd ever pressed for her. "I made those," Walt said, and his old voice didn't shake near as much as he'd feared it would. "And I kept a copy of every one, the way an honest teller does. Mr. Meacham fired me last spring for keeping honest books. Now you all know why." The crowd made a sound then, not a cheer, something lower, a kind of grinding murmur, the sound of 100 people turning at once to look at the man on the top step. Meacham found his voice. "Carbon copies prove nothing. A woman keeps a shoebox of scraps and thinks she's rewritten the law. The ledger stands. The default stands. This farm, Mr. Meacham, the stranger in spectacles, said it mildly, and it cut through everything." He came up the steps unhurried and opened his flat leather case on the stone beside the tin. "My name is Estep. I'm a bank examiner for the state of Nebraska. I've had your books 3 days now." He drew out a single sheet. "And I have here your suspense account." He set it down. A third row, in a third hand, the bank's own internal sheet, ruled and columned, and every entry on it a payment Cora Ellison had made in cash across 6 years, run not to her note where it belonged but off to the side, parked, hidden, in a holding line that fed nothing and paid nothing down. 3 records, Estep said, and he ran one finger down them, tin to carbon to suspense sheet. The depositor's receipts, the teller's carbons, and the bank's own concealment of them. They agree with one another to the dollar, and all 3 of them stand against that ledger. He looked up over his spectacles at Meacham. "The balance in your book is a fiction, sir. The true remaining balance on this note is $290. And I have some questions, under oath, about who moved these funds and why. You could have heard a hen fret 3 farms off." Cora Ellison turned then, away from the examiner, away from the crowd, and faced the man on the top step directly, one time, for the first time since he'd slid her ledger back across his counter. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying. Her voice came out flat and carrying and calm as a well. "You told the whole street my butter money wasn't real, Mr. Meacham," she said. "It was real enough to buy this farm back. And it was real enough to buy your books and examiner." Then she bent, and she picked up the tin, and she poured it out into her own 2 hands. Not paper now, but the coins. The quarters and dimes and worn dollars and the small folded bills she'd carried against this day, egg money and butter money. The hard, cold weight of 6 years of 5 in the morning cold and cracked hands. "Sheriff," she said, "I'll pay the note. The true note. Right here, where every one of these people heard him call it nothing." And she counted it out into the sheriff's cupped hands on the courthouse step. Coin by coin. $290. She counted slow, out loud, and the whole town of Holloway stood in the white dust and listened to a widow count butter money into a lawman's hands, dollar over dollar over dollar, until the note her husband signed in 1920 was paid clean to the last dime in front of every soul who'd watched her shamed. The sheriff, red-faced, counted it a second time himself because he had to. And then he said, not loud, that the debt was satisfied. The sale was off, the deed was clear, free and clear, to no one but herself. Now, the faces. Harlan Meacham's went first, and it went slow, which was the mercy of it and the cruelty both. The smile didn't fall all at once. It came apart in pieces, the way ice does, while a step stood beside him reciting figures, misapplication of depositor funds, account for each account. The Grange wives' names read off one after another into the still air, Pardee, and the next, and the next. Meacham kept trying to talk over it. He said the thing he'd built his whole plan on, said it out loud without knowing he was doing it. A farm widow doesn't keep records. She reads no fine print. That's not. And he heard it hit the silence and die there, heard his own certainty read back to him as the confession it was, and he stopped. He looked out over the crowd for one friendly face and didn't find one. His mouth closed. He had nothing left to smile with. Vernon Ashby's face went second, and his was almost comic if it hadn't been so cold. He'd stood the whole while with his checkbook out, tapping, and now he looked down at it in his hand like he'd forgotten what it was for. There was no farm to buy. There was no well to buy. The one deep shaft of good water in the whole dry township had just been paid free and clear by a woman he'd tipped his hat to, and no check in his book could reach it now. He put the checkbook away. He didn't say a word to anybody. He walked back to the black automobile through the parting crowd, and he was a man who'd never once in his life imagined water could be out of his reach. And now it was, and he had no idea what to do with his hands. The car started. The dust took him off down the road, the same road he'd come up so sure. The sheriff's face was third, and his was the quietest. He'd never wanted any of it. He peeled the sale bill down off where he'd tacked it, and he folded it in half, and he held it out to Cora, not to keep, just to hand back, so she'd have the thing that had had her name on it. "Ma'am," he said. And that was all he said, but he took his hat off to do it. And the Grange wives were last, and they weren't gloating either. That was the thing Cora would remember longest. They didn't crow. They just came up, one and then another, Ruth Pardee first, each of them reaching into a coat pocket, and they laid their own soft-cornered slips of butter money paper down on that courthouse step beside Cora's, in front of the examiner, now that the door stood open. 7 of them. Then more, women Cora didn't even know had a note at that bank, coming up out of the crowd with paper in their hands. Not one of them said a hard word. They didn't have to. Their receipts said it for them. Laid out in the sun, a whole town's worth of work that a man had called nothing, all of it counted now, all of it real. A step gathered every slip like they were made of gold. Cora Ellison put the empty blue tin back under her arm and walked down off the courthouse steps and out through a crowd that opened for her the way water opens. And she went home to her leghorns and she milked because it was still a Monday, and the animals didn't know or care that anything at all had happened. 1 year on. It's autumn now, and the drought's still on, though they say it's breaking in the north. The section road runs white and dry as ever. But the deep Ellison well pulls cold, clean water same as it did the day Thomas hit it in 1920, and the leghorns are loud in the yard at dawn, near 200 of them fussing for their feed, and 12 dozen eggs a week still go into Holloway. And 40 pounds of butter, and the money still walks to the bank on Cora's own 2 feet. It's a different bank now. Reorganized, the state made them call it, after they took Harlan Meacham out of it. He's under indictment for the suspense account money, awaiting a court date in Lincoln, and no soft mouth-only smile is going to talk him out of the paper that's on him. A widow's receipts. 7 farm wives' receipts, his own hidden sheet in his own hand. Vernon Ashby's company folded its tent and went off chasing water in other counties, and the well he wanted so bad still belongs to the woman who dug her heels in over it. And old Walt Dorsey, old Walt sits behind the counter of that reorganized bank 5 days a week, rehired. The very first thing they did. The man who kept honest slips, stamping receipts for farm wives with hands that don't shake anymore at all. The deed hangs framed on the pantry wall now, up over the shelf where the blue lard tin used to sit. Cora doesn't need the tin anymore, so it's back to holding lard. But she left the deed right there on purpose, over that spot, so every morning when she reaches up for something she sees it. There's a soft grace note to leave you on. A letter came in the spring, from Meacham's wife of all people. A few lines, ashamed, not asking forgiveness exactly, just wanting Cora to know she hadn't known. Cora read it once. She didn't answer it, but she didn't burn it either. And she didn't say a cruel word about it to a living soul. Some things you just let lie. That's a kind of strength too. She takes her coffee on the porch now at first light, the way Thomas used to. The churn turns fresh beside her, the hens carry on, the water comes up cold and good, and here's the whole of it, the thing she'd tell you if you sat down on that porch step beside her. The work a man won't count is still the work that buys the ground. Egg money is real money. Butter money is real money. A woman's careful hand on a soft little slip of paper is real, and it will stand, in the end, against any lie a proud man writes in a big book, if she keeps it, and if she's patient, and if she's got the nerve to set her tin down on the courthouse step and take off the lid. Cora Ellison kept hers. So if you've watched this far, if you've ever had your own good work called nothing by somebody who never once counted it, tell me the town you're watching from tonight. I'd like to see just how far this old Nebraska story travels.